The rain had been falling over Ashcombe for 3 days without pause, and Lady Cecilia Hartwell had spent most of that time at the window of the east drawing-room, watching the gravel drive turn to a dark, glistening ribbon beneath the elms. She was 23, unmarried, and, as her mother reminded her with increasing frequency, no longer in possession of the excuse of youth to explain either condition. Ashcombe Park had belonged to the Hartwells for 4 generations, a handsome grey stone house set among 400 acres of Yorkshire farmland, its rooms full of the particular chill that only old houses seem to hold on to, no matter the season. Cecilia's father, the Earl of Marchmont, was a man whose title had long since outgrown his fortune. The estate's tenant farms had suffered through 2 poor harvests, the roof of the west wing wanted repair that nobody could presently afford, and a mortgage taken out by Cecilia's grandfather in a moment of optimism now sat over the family like a low grey sky that refused to lift. It was for this reason, and no other that anyone spoke of openly, that Mr. Thomas Reed had come to Ashcombe. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, in a hired gig that splashed mud up the hem of his one good coat, carrying with him a single trunk and a letter of introduction from a Mr. Aldous Gray, a Cambridge don who had once tutored the Earl's late brother. The letter described Mr. Reed as a young man of exceptional competence in matters of accounting and land management, the son of a country clergyman, educated beyond his station by scholarship and his own persistence, and entirely without connections that might trouble a family of consequence. It was this last point, more than any other, that had recommended him to the Earl. A land steward from a family of standing might have ideas above his position. A clergyman's son with no fortune of his own would know precisely where he stood. Cecilia was not present for his arrival. She learned of it from her younger brother Edmund, who came bounding into the morning room with the breathless report that "Father's hired a man to sort out the accounts, and he's not much older than Harry from the stables, only he talks like a book." "That is an unkind way to describe a person you have not yet properly met," Cecilia said, though she smiled as she said it, for Edmund at 16 had not yet learned to disguise his opinions, and she found this more often refreshing than not. She did not think of Mr. Reed again until 3 days later, when she came upon him in the estate library, which had for some years served as a sort of storage room for old furniture and forgotten portraits as much as for books. He was standing on a low stool, reaching for a ledger on the topmost shelf, his sleeves pushed back and a smear of dust along one forearm, and he did not hear her enter. "You'll want the steps from the hall closet," she said. "That stool has a wobble in the left leg. It's put my aunt on the floor twice." He turned, nearly lost his balance in the process, and caught himself against the shelf with a small, undignified sound that he seemed immediately to regret. When he had righted himself and stepped down, he bowed with a precision that struck her as slightly too careful, the bow of a man who had practiced such things rather than been born to them. "Lady Cecilia, I presume. I beg your pardon, I did not mean to make free with the library without leave." "You have my father's leave, I should think, if you are meant to be sorting out his accounts, and half his accounts appear to be buried in this room under my great-grandfather's hunting trophies." She glanced at the shelf he had been reaching toward. "What is it you're after?" "The estate ledgers from before the mortgage was taken. Your father mentioned there might be earlier records that would help me understand how the debt accumulated, and where the land might yet be made to pay for itself. You'll be some time finding anything in here. Nothing has been properly catalogued since my grandmother died, and she was the last person in this house who cared for order." He looked at the room, really looked at it, she thought, in a way that suggested he was not merely being polite, and said, "Then perhaps I ought to begin with the catalogue before I begin with the accounts." It was a small remark, practical rather than charming, and yet Cecilia found herself unexpectedly amused by it, by the plainness of a man who did not attempt to flatter her, or indeed to acknowledge her rank at all beyond the formality of his bow. She was accustomed, in the drawing-rooms of her mother's acquaintance, to a particular kind of attention from young men, attention that measured her value in the currency of her father's title and calculated, however politely, whether that value exceeded the modesty of her dowry. Mr. Reed, it seemed, had not yet learned to do this, or did not think it his place to try. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Mr. Reed," she said, and left him to his dust and his ledgers. Over the following weeks, Cecilia found reasons to return to the library with a regularity that she did not, at first, examine too closely. She had always been a reader in a house that valued reading only in the abstract. Her mother kept novels on the drawing-room shelves as objects of taste rather than use, and the disorder of the library offered her a private occupation that nobody thought to question. She began, without quite deciding to, helping Mr. Reed sort the old volumes, separating estate records from sermons and sermons from the yellowing correspondence of relatives 3 generations dead. He was, she came to learn, 26 years old, the second son of a clergyman in Northumberland, who had been sent up to Cambridge on a scholarship secured by the same Mr. Gray who had written his letter of introduction. He had a way of speaking about numbers that made them seem less like sums and more like a language with its own grammar and logic, and he explained the estate's finances to her, patiently, and without the condescension she had come to expect from men discussing money in the presence of a woman, until she understood, for the first time in her life, exactly how precarious her family situation had become. "The mortgage itself is not unmanageable," he told her one gray afternoon in November, both of them seated at the long table with ledgers spread between them like a hand of cards. "But 2 years of poor harvests on top of it have left very little margin. If next year is fair and the tenant farms are properly managed, your father's situation will ease considerably. If it is not," he did not finish the sentence and did not need to. "And if it is not? Then a decision will have to be made about the mortgage, and it will not be an easy one." Cecilia understood, though neither of them said it aloud, what such a decision generally entailed for a family in her position. A marriage arranged not for affection but for the settlement it would bring. She had known this in an abstract way for years. It was the ordinary condition of women of her class, discussed at dinner tables with the same practical tone one might use for the weather, but she had not, until that autumn, felt the particular weight of it pressing against her own life. It was some weeks later, in December, that Viscount Aldridge began calling at Ashcombe with a frequency that left no one in doubt of his purpose. He was a man of 35, pleasant enough in company, possessed of a fortune considerable enough to clear the Hartwell debts twice over, and entirely uninterested, so far as Cecilia could discern, in anything about her beyond her father's title and her own tolerable appearance. Her mother spoke of him at every opportunity with a warmth that bordered on relief, and Cecilia understood, without being told outright, that her family's hopes had settled upon him with the finality of a decision already made. She said as much to Mr. Reed one evening, when the two of them remained later than usual in the library, the fire burned down to embers and the rest of the house gone quiet. "They mean for me to marry him," she said, not looking up from the ledger before her. "Nothing has been said directly, but I am not a fool, Mr. Reed, whatever else I may be." "I don't doubt your understanding of it," he said carefully. "Only whether it is a marriage that would make you happy. Happiness is not generally the object of such arrangements." "No," he agreed. "I suppose it is not." There was something in the quiet of his answer that she did not examine that night, though she thought of it often in the weeks that followed. A restraint in his voice that suggested more than the words themselves permitted him to say. She told herself it was nothing, or ought to be nothing, and went on finding reasons to spend her afternoons in the disordered library among the old ledgers and the smell of dust and rain. It was not a single moment that changed the nature of things between them, but an accumulation of many small ones. An afternoon when he showed her how to trace the pattern of a bad harvest through 5 years of tenant rents, and she found herself more absorbed in the puzzle of it than in anything she had studied in a schoolroom. An evening when Edmund fell from his horse and broke his wrist, and it was Mr. Reed, not the family physician, who kept the boy calm and distracted with a card trick. Until the doctor arrived, a morning when Cecilia came upon him reading, of all things, one of the novels her mother kept for show, and he confessed with visible embarrassment that he had borrowed it because the estate ledgers had, for once, defeated his patience. By January she understood plainly enough what she felt, and understood equally plainly that it was a feeling she could not afford. Thomas Reed had no fortune, no family name that would satisfy her father, no prospects beyond what his own labor might earn him. A woman of her rank did not marry a clergyman's son who worked for wages, however gently born or well educated he might be. She had been raised to know this as thoroughly as she knew her own name, and no quantity of quiet afternoons in a dusty library could alter the arithmetic of it. She said nothing of this to him, and told herself that her silence was a kindness, to him, to her family, to the plain fact of things as they were. But silence, she was beginning to learn, was not so easily kept when two people spent their days in close company over shared work, and she began to suspect that Mr. Reed's own reticence concealed a feeling not unlike her own. It was Edmund, in the end, who forced the matter into the open, though he had no notion of doing so. "You like Mr. Reed a great deal more than you like the Viscount," he announced one evening at dinner, with the guileless cruelty of a younger brother, "and I don't see why you oughtn't say so, since everybody can see it plainly enough." Her mother's face went the particular shade of white that Cecilia had learned to recognize as the prelude to a scene, and her father set down his glass with a care that was somehow more alarming than if he had slammed it. "Edmund," the Earl said in a voice of quiet, terrible calm, "you will apologize to your sister, and you will not repeat such a remark in this house again." "I only meant—" "You will apologize." Edmund apologized, chastened and confused by the severity of a response so disproportionate, as it seemed to him, to so small an observation. But the words had been said and could not be unsaid, and Cecilia understood from the look that passed between her parents, that the matter would not end at the dinner table. She was proven right the following morning, when her father summoned her to his study, a room she entered perhaps twice a year, and never without a sense of being called before a magistrate. "Your brother's remark last evening was, I hope, nothing more than a boy's careless talk," the Earl said without preamble once she had seated herself. "But I would be failing in my duty as your father if I did not ask you plainly whether there is any truth in it." Cecilia had rehearsed, in the sleepless hours of the night before, a dozen different answers to this question, ranging from flat denial to a defense so passionate it would have confirmed every suspicion her father held. In the event, she found she could manage neither. "I have a great respect for Mr. Reed," she said. "He has been a kind and honest friend to this family, and I will not pretend otherwise merely to satisfy a question I think unworthy of being asked in the first place." "That is not an answer, Cecilia." "It is the only answer I intend to give." Her father studied her for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge of severity and taken on something closer to weariness. "You are 23. You understand your situation as well as I do, better perhaps, since Mr. Reed himself has seen fit to explain it to you in more particular detail than I have. Viscount Aldrich has all but declared his intentions. If you refuse him or give him cause to withdraw them, I do not know how this family is to keep this house past the next bad harvest." "That is not a threat, Cecilia. It is simply the truth, and I think you owe it to yourself to look at it plainly." She had no answer to this because there was no answer that did not require her to argue against the truth of it, and so she said nothing at all, and left her father's study with a particular hollow feeling of having lost an argument she had not been permitted to make. Mr. Reed was dismissed from Ashcombe 11 days later. The Earl gave as his public reason that the estate's accounts had been sufficiently set in order and a steward's services were no longer required at such expense. A reason plausible enough that the household staff had no cause to question it, and cruel enough, in its very plausibility, that Cecilia understood it for what it truly was. She learned of his dismissal not from her father but from Edmund, who came to her that afternoon with the news delivered in the subdued voice of a boy who understood, now, the size of the trouble his careless words had caused, though he did not fully understand its shape. "He's leaving in the morning," Edmund said. "I heard father tell him this afternoon. He didn't argue it. He only said he understood and thanked father for the position, and that was all." Cecilia found Thomas that evening in the library, where he was packing the last of his own papers into a small case, the room already returning to the disorder from which they had rescued it together over 3 months of shared afternoons. "You needn't have come," he said without turning. "It will only make things harder for you, and I have caused this family enough difficulty already." "You have caused this family nothing. My brother has a loose tongue, and my father a fear of poverty greater than his regard for anyone's happiness, including my own. Neither of those things is your doing." He turned to look at her then, and she saw in his face an exhaustion that went beyond the simple fact of losing a position. "I ought to have left Ashcombe the day I understood my own feelings, Lady Cecilia. I told myself I could manage them, that they need touch nothing beyond my own conscience. I was wrong, and it is you who will bear the cost of my being wrong, which is a thing I cannot forgive myself for whatever else happens now." "Then say plainly what you have not said," she answered, "since we are neither of us likely to have another chance at plain speaking, and I find I have grown tired of everyone in this house speaking around the truth instead of through it." He set down the papers in his hands. "I love you. I have known it for some months and said nothing, because I understood from the first day I came to this house that nothing could come of it, and I thought silence the kinder course for both our sakes. I do not know that I was right to think so. I only know that I could not, in honesty, leave this house without telling you the truth of it once, even if the truth changes nothing. It does not change what my father intends for me, she said, and I will not pretend otherwise, because I think you have earned better than pretense from me. But I do not intend to marry Viscount Aldridge, Mr. Reed, whatever my father wishes, and whatever it costs this family to refuse him. I had determined that much before my brother ever opened his mouth at dinner. And what will you do instead? I do not yet know. But I would rather face an uncertain future honestly than a comfortable one built on a lie I would carry for the rest of my life. She paused. I do not ask you to wait for me or to hope for anything on my account. I know as well as you what stands against us. I ask only that you not mistake my silence these past weeks for indifference. It was never that. He did not answer this at once, and when he did, his voice was quieter than she had yet heard it. I have very little to offer a woman of your situation, Lady Cecilia. A position not yet found, a name with no fortune behind it, and a future I cannot presently describe to you with any certainty. I would not ask you to give up everything you have known for so uncertain a prospect. You have not asked. I am telling you of my own will, that I find the prospect less uncertain than the alternative. She held out her hand, not in the manner of a lady extending courtesy, but plainly as one adult offers a hand to another. I do not know what will come of this, Mr. Reed. I know only that I do not intend to spend the rest of my life wondering what might have, had I said nothing tonight. He took her hand and held it a moment longer than propriety strictly permitted, and neither of them spoke of it again that evening because there was, for the moment, nothing more that needed saying. What followed was neither swift nor easy, and Cecilia would not, in later years, describe it as a romance in the manner of the novels her mother kept for show. Thomas Reed left Ashcombe the following morning as arranged and took a position, secured through Mr. Grey's continuing goodwill, as a land agent for a smaller estate in Durham, respectable work, though far beneath what the Earl of Marchmont's daughter might reasonably expect of a husband. Cecilia refused Viscount Aldridge's proposal that spring, an act that produced, as her father had warned her it would, a season of considerable strain within the family, and a winter that followed it leaner than any Ashcombe had yet endured. The mortgage was not cleared by the marriage her parents had hoped for, and the roof of the west wing went another year unrepaired, and there were evenings that spring when Cecilia lay awake wondering whether the cost of her honesty had fallen, in the end, more heavily on her family than on herself. But the following harvest was a fair one, the first in 3 years, and with it came enough relief in the estate's accounts that the Earl's anger, never so absolute as his pride had made it appear, began at last to soften into something closer to resignation, and then, with time, into a grudging respect for a daughter who had refused a comfortable marriage on a principle he found himself, however reluctantly, unable to fully condemn. Cecilia and Thomas corresponded through that year with a regularity that was, by the standards of their circumstances, entirely improper, and entirely necessary to both of them. He wrote of Durham, of tenant disputes and land surveys and a cottage he had begun, with quiet optimism, to imagine furnished for two rather than one. She wrote of Ashcombe, of her father's slow thaw and her mother's continuing disappointment and Edmund's earnest, clumsy attempts to make amends for a remark he had never meant as more than a boy's careless observation. They were married in the autumn of the following year, in a small ceremony at Durham that Cecilia's father attended with an expression that suggested duty rather than delight, though he gave the bride away himself, and shook Thomas Reed's hand afterward with a firmness that Cecilia chose to take as its own kind of blessing. She did not become, in marrying him, a woman of fashion or consequence in the manner her mother had once imagined for her. The house in Durham was modest, the income steady but unremarkable, and there were seasons in the years that followed when the old habits of her upbringing, the expectation of servants, of a certain ease in daily life, had to be quietly, sometimes painfully, unlearned. But she kept, in the small study of that modest house, the same ledgers she and Thomas had first sorted together in the disordered library at Ashcombe, and she would say, when asked in later years how she had come to marry so far beneath what her birth had promised her, that she had never once regretted an arithmetic that had, in the end, cost her a fortune and given her, in its place, a life she had chosen honestly, with her own eyes fully open to its price. It was not, she would sometimes reflect, the story her mother would have wished to tell of her. But it was, she thought, a truer one than most, truer certainly than the comfortable fiction she had so nearly agreed to live instead.